Hello again, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Epicurus and his ideas about pleasure and the good life. So essentially, we're looking at the Epicurean moral theory. And so, as you saw in the text above this video, Epicurus was an atomist. So he believed that the atomist picture we discussed a couple weeks ago is the correct view of reality. All there are. A number of atoms and void for the atoms to move around in. And he wants to take it further than the atomist did and find out what that metaphysical picture says, not just about the nature of reality, but also can it tell us anything about what we should do in terms of ethics or how to live the best life. So in the following videos, we'll talk about what he thought the atomist picture says for death and God, but here we're going to specifically talk about his ideas of pleasure and the good life. So to start, Epicurus held the pleasure principle. And so roughly this says that the standard of goodness is the obtaining of pleasure and the absence of pain. Okay, and so you should be wondering, did Epicurus ever argue for this principle? And the answer is not really. So roughly, he just thought that this was a fundamental principle, right? So we can always do sort of the chain of questioning that a child does, right? And so you can give an explanation and then ask why and keep asking why every time an answer is given. Eventually, we'll just reach a point where we say, no, that's the end. We can't go any further. This is the fundamental starting point. And so Epicurus is doing something roughly like that. He thinks we have reason to believe that pleasure is the standard of goodness, but he doesn't have a strong argument for this. So, a quote from Epicurus says, "We recognize pleasure as the first good innate in us, and from pleasure we begin every act of choice and avoidance, and to pleasure we return again." So in other words, pleasure is just something that we realize from the very beginning is desirable. Right? So we don't need to be able to reason about the world. Even as children, we just move toward things that bring us pleasure, move away from things that bring us pain. So it's just a brute fact of our experience that there's something about the way humans are made up that makes pleasure something that we want and pain something we want to get away from. And so nowadays you can probably give some evolutionary argument as to why that is, right? Pleasurable things often led us to survival and procreation, and obviously avoiding pain has pretty good survivability to it, right? But Epicurus wasn't thinking about it in those terms. He was just thinking there's some sort of innate desire we have for pleasure and avoiding pain. So it's not really a strong argument for this pleasure principle, but this is why he thinks we can't ask that why question anymore. We've just hit this fundamental starting point. It's just something about the structure of humans that makes it so. Okay, but as you saw from Hedonism Bot, if you ever watch Futurama, Hedonism Bot is this robot who just is all about gaining pleasure in any sort of way he can. Right? And it doesn't matter where the pleasure comes from, he just wants to attain as much pleasure as possible. So you might be thinking that's what Epicurus has in mind here. We should just be striving to obtain pleasure and avoid pain, and we can do that in any way possible. But that's not true for Epicurus. Epicurus thinks we should try and seek out very particular pleasures. And that's because he thinks all pleasures are not equal. So there are a couple distinctions we can make when we're talking about pleasure. And the first of these two distinctions is that between bodily pleasure and mental pleasure. And so I think this should be pretty easy to understand. Bodily pleasure, we get that when we fulfill our desires for food, drink, sleep, sex, drugs, back rubs, so on, right? Itching your foot, right? Itching your nose. These are things that bring you bodily pleasure. All of these things and there's thousands of others we could list too, right? But they're all these simple pleasures of the body. There are also mental pleasures, and so these can be very complex. They can be simple too, but these can get very complex. So here are a few examples of mental pleasures. We get mental pleasure when we fulfill our desire for power, knowledge, achievement, contemplation, problem solving. So it might not be clear how it works in all of these, but think about it in the following way, right? So you have a difficult problem in front of you, and then you spend all this time thinking about it and you solve that problem, right? You get a good amount of mental pleasure, mental satisfaction from solving that problem. If you're the type of person who desires power, well, as you accrue more and more power, right, you'll gain more and more pleasure. So this can deal with power, or greed, or achievement, or money, right? These can all give you mental pleasures as you accrue these things. Now, there's another distinction we can also make. So there's not just the distinction between bodily pleasure and mental pleasure. There's the distinction between what Epicurus thought were fully satisfiable pleasures versus pleasures that can never be fully satisfied. So fully satisfiable pleasures will be something like problem solving or particular achievement, knowledge, bodily pleasures that don't necessarily reoccur all the time. Right? So think about problem solving. So if you're working on a difficult math problem and then you finally come to the realization, you find the answer, then you never have to worry about that again, right? Once that problem has been solved, your desire to solve the problem has been fully satisfied. So problem solving is just a great example of something that can be satisfiable. Knowledge, right? As you gain knowledge of particular subjects, you don't have to regain that knowledge over and over again, right? So if you want to know a lot about physics, right, you can study. You can go to school or read books or whatever it is, talk to physicists, and learn a number of things about physics. And as you learn each little bit of information, that's now satisfying your desire for knowledge in that area. Particular achievements, right? So if you want to say it's an achievement for you to get your driver's license, right? You don't have to do that 10 years down the road and 20 years down the road over and over again. Once you've received your driver's license, you've fully satisfied that particular desire for achievement. Bodily pleasures get a little bit more complicated here. So it's going to turn out that a lot of our bodily pleasures can't be fully satisfied. So let's talk about pleasures that can't be fully satisfied, and then we'll come back and talk about some body pleasures that might be fully satisfiable. So we have some pleasures that can just never be fully satisfied, and one will be our desire for power. At least Epicurus thinks power, greed, money, all of these things are desires that can never be fully satisfied. And why is that? Well, unfortunately, when you want power, Epicurus thinks it's something that doesn't have a cap to it, right? There's no endpoint. So as you're desiring more and more power, say you reach, right, you're more powerful than you were a decade ago, and then you keep getting more and more powerful. Since there's no endpoint, this is a type of pleasure that's always going to come with a little bit of pain, right? Because you can never actually fully satisfy your desire for power. There's always more to be had. Another example of something that can't be fully satisfied is hunger, right? So say I have a nice meal right now. 2 hours from now, I'm going to be hungry again, right? And that's not ever going to stop. I'm just going to keep being hungry and thirsty repeatedly throughout my life. That's something that's going to constantly reoccur. So I can never fully satisfy my desire to eat, right? I can temporarily satisfy it, but I can never sort of close the book and fully satisfy it. And the same will be true for thirst, and so on. Now, are there any bodily pleasures that are fully satisfiable? Sure. So, okay, say I have a desire to work out a knot in my muscle in my back. So I go and get a massage. They release the tension, right? The knot's gone. Okay, that's been fully satisfied now. I don't need to have that done in a recurring fashion. Now, it's not to say that I'll never get another knot that'll need work, right? But it's something that can be fully satisfied. Excuse me. Uh, the same will just depend on your own sort of desires too, right? So some people only need to have certain bodily desires like once or twice, and then they're good to go, right? So maybe you've always wanted to have acupuncture done, and so you fulfill your desire for acupuncture, you get that bodily pleasure out of it, and then you don't ever have to do it again, right? You may want to do it again, but it's not going to necessarily reoccur. That's the important part. So hunger and thirst will necessarily reoccur. Your desire for, say, acupuncture won't. Okay, so now we have, hopefully, a good understanding of what's going on here. We can divide pleasures up in two ways, between the bodily and the mental, and then we can take the bodily and the mental and divide them again into those bodily desires that are either fully satisfiable or can never be fully satisfied, and then the same with the mental pleasures that can be fully satisfied or never be fully satisfied. So what are we to make from all of these distinctions? Well, not all pleasures are created equal. So some are going to be better than others. And Epicurus thought the best types of pleasures were those that were mental and fully satisfiable. Right? So the example that seems to work for most people is think of the following two scenarios. Right? You can either eat a fancy dinner or go and solve a difficult problem. Well, if we eat a fancy dinner, that's going to be temporarily satisfying, right? Our hunger is going to reoccur soon, even if our hunger is only for maybe something not as fancy in the future, right? We're still going to want these good foods again very soon. Right? Whereas if we solve a difficult problem, we get all of that mental pleasure and it's fully satisfied forever. New problems might arise, but that particular problem has been solved. So he thought the mental pleasures were definitely more valuable than the bodily pleasures. They could bring more long-lasting and intense pleasure. But even among those mental pleasures, he thought we shouldn't go for things like power and greed or money, because those things have no cap. We're always going to want more. We should go for mental things that are fully satisfiable, like particular achievement or problem solving. Okay, so, excuse me. How do we live the best life? Well, we try to gain as much pleasure as we can while eliminating pain. And so, as you would guess, from what's been said so far, Epicurus thought the best life was sort of one where we try and attain all of this fully satisfiable mental pleasure. But we also need to still worry about the body, right? So the body's not just going to give up all of its desires. So even if we spend all of this time going for the mental fully satisfiable and avoiding those mental pleasures that can't be satisfied, like power, money, and glory, we're still going to have to at least do something about the body. If we just ignore it, we'll be in constant pain. So what we need to do here is try to minimize our bodily desires. And so here you might think of ascetic monks or individuals who give up sort of worrying about the material things in the world and just try and minimize their desires. So Epicurus would think we should take our bodily desires for food and drink and bring them down to whatever we need is a minimum for ourselves to be happy. Right? So if you can be happy on bread and water, then you should do that. So the wise person is able to determine what the minimum is that her nature requires and easily and quickly satisfy those needs. And by working with that minimum, we'll never feel pain from the absence or failure to satisfy a complicated need. So essentially, Epicurus thinks we should be living a very simple life, where we focus on mental contemplation and minimize the needs of the body. And that's it for Epicurus and pleasure. Next, we'll talk about what he thinks atomism says about God and death. Thank you.